Hello and welcome to the Education on Fire podcast. The place where we share creative and inspiring learning in our schools. Season 4, Episode 44. Hello and welcome back to the Education on Fire podcast with me, Mark Taylor. Today I'm joined by Brian Greene, who's the CEO and founder of Gigajam.com. And he's somebody that I spoke to at the BET show earlier back in January, which is when you would remember from my season 2, we went round and did lots of stuff based on tech. But this particularly was really interesting to me because obviously it's music related as well as the tech. And so having spoken to Brian, I said I definitely need to get him on when we start doing our music season, which is where we are now here in season 4. So thanks for being on the show, Brian. I'm really glad we're going to get a chance to chat now and really dive into what Gigajam is all about. So welcome, and can you just give us a bit of history about yourself and how Gigajam was formed and a sort of an idea of what Gigajam is?
Yes, of course. Thanks, Mark, and thanks for inviting us on the show. I really appreciate that. My background is one of a professional drummer, dare I say musician, and prior to that, excuse me, I worked for Barclays Bank for 10 years for my sins. And then decided that actually I'd rather do something that I had a massive passion for. So I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to become a professional player. I wouldn't go as far as to say that I was a session player, although I did do sessions in the early days. Sort of fairly notable were sort of Generation Game and Record Breakers and a few other TV things that I was very fortunate to play on. Thoroughly enjoyed, but most of my work was commercial work, so that would be shows, pantomimes, summer seasons, tours, playing with a few bands and bits and pieces like that. So I was very fortunate to have a quite a varied professional career as I started out. As I got a bit older, touring became less appealing, so I wanted to work more from home, so I sort of reinvented myself, and I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to become a drum teacher at Drum Tech in London, which is now part of the BIM group, so it's moved on considerably. At that time it was developing into higher education, for further education, and I ended up as the academic head there for a while, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And to some extent, I actually began to realise that teaching and coaching was a really sort of really enjoyable skill, and it touched on other parts of my skill base that I hadn't realised existed. So I thoroughly enjoyed that. And I was fortunate enough to actually become a university lecturer for Thames Valley University at the time, as was now University of West London, which took me in a whole new direction. So I had this, I think people now are very used to the idea of having a portfolio career, but at that time you tended to do one or the other. So I was playing as a professional musician and a university lecturer. And then I started to say, well, look, we've got a problem here, that we had people coming into Drum Tech who really wanted to be professional players. But at that time, which was sort of mid-90s, the formal education of musicians was really done by the conservatoires and Royal Academy of Music and the classical grade. So rock and pop music at that time was not terribly well taught, certainly not very well structured. So somewhere like Drum Tech was a bit of a godsend, but even that was quite ad hoc. And students were coming through on the possibility of going into higher education and getting a degree in performing arts, and actually the structures really weren't there, and the ability level was really quite patchy. So you had very talented musicians, but they weren't trained for all the necessary disciplines to become professional musicians. So I was very fortunate to be at that moment, that changeover, where that whole education in rock and pop started to become more professional. Rock school started to come through, etc., and to some extent, the rest is history. So rock and pop now is is really well taught across the board. But there was a problem in that there was a scale issue. So there were lots of people who were coming to the university who just didn't have the skills. And of course, we know that's still the case to a large extent, because there is a huge amount of demand for music lessons, but not the number of teachers, and not the amount of money available to be able to fund people to have lessons to enable them to develop their skills, or even in the first instance have the opportunity to even see that they have a chance of learning to play an instrument at a high level. So that's where Gigajam came from, where I looked at the scale issue and said, look, what we need to do is take quality education. We need to now make it available to everybody, not just in these centres of excellence in London at the time, and Guildford was coming through there, the ACM, but actually to look at how the internet can reach more people, more scalably, and more affordably. So, a drum tech course at that time would have been £3,500–4,000. So it's a considerable. I know that sounds like peanuts now when it's £10,000 a year, but in those days it was certainly for the elite. So that's very much where Gigajam was born.
And so it sounds really as if it's that sort of, say, it's guitar, bass, keyboards, drums. That's kind of the basis of it. Which, of course, children, especially in schools, are that's their sort of their immediate understanding. It's what they hear the most of, probably, you would say, these days in school as well. So, from a practical standpoint, then, having set Gigajam up, how does it work within a school setup, or how does it work as an online organisation?
Yeah, so there's two sides to it, and I think focusing on the educational side, if I may. It's very much about using the internet into the classroom in support of the teacher as delivery, to provide what is in England. It's not the case in Scotland, for instance, but under the English curriculum and many curriculums that we see abroad, is that actually learning to play a musical instrument is not part of the DNA, really, of many curriculums in music, and hasn't been stressed, certainly by the national curriculum. You will get teachers who will want to do that as a natural course, but actually most learning of a musical instrument takes place outside of the music classroom, in the surrounding rooms, and is often undertaken with the support of the music services. And so what we wanted to do was to provide classroom teachers with more opportunities to bring instrumental learning into the classroom as part of the curriculum, to support their students to become more musically literate and more musically skilled, to be able to engage fully in the national curriculum, which is very much about music making, is very much about performing, it's about listening to others, etc. I don't need to tell you what's in the curriculum, but those things are difficult to do if you can't articulate yourself as a musician. Not impossible, but hard to do. And I know there are great arguments about music as an academic subject, etc., etc. But I think most people would expect, when their child goes to a secondary school, that their child would have an opportunity to learn to play a musical instrument, for instance. So how does it actually work is simply as there is a kind of replication or simulation of the one-to-one concept that you would have as a student going out of the classroom, in that the computer has the lessons all effectively recorded for the individual students: guitar, bass, keyboards, and drums. A classroom teacher then facilitates that learning so that students can have a one-to-one experience with the computer, but supported by the classroom teacher. So, for instance, if you're learning to play the keyboard, you'll have your lessons online. The whole course is laid out in front of you. You go from exercise to exercise, learning both the theory and the practical. You record your performances into the computer. There's a little bit of software there that gives you immediate feedback as to how you're doing, so that the student can start to make decisions. Oh, how well did I do? What do I need to do better? And then they can repeat that process as much as they like within an exercise, and then over the whole course, building up their portfolio and building up their skills over time, and actually even gaining grades as a result. But the teacher actually then has a different role. It's a little bit like Musical Futures. In that, the teacher becomes much more of a facilitator of the learning rather than the guider of the learning. It is quite interesting that I actually read Lucy Greene's book at about the same time that the Musical Futures guys were reading Lucy Greene's book, and I came up with Gigajam, and they came up with Musical Futures. So sort of a different sort of response to that identification of how young people learn music. And mine was very much about the difficulties that children, students, young people, and adults, in fact, we have quite a lot of older people who learn the Gigajam, but actually that ability to learn on your own, but being very, very supported with the continual and formative assessment to enable you to see whether you're making progress. So beyond the individual interaction that takes place, I'm always at pains to say it does look like a child is operating in a vacuum, but you know what it's like in a busy classroom. You've got conversation that takes place between the teacher and the students and the student they're sitting next to. You have this peer-to-peer learning going on. Often I see a student saying, hang on a minute, you haven't played that power chord correctly because you've played all 6 strings instead of just the bottom 2 strings. And then a child, as a result of their student's intervention, has actually improved their score. So, it's not about the technology. It's about how the technology enhances learning. So it's very much about technology-enhanced learning rather than technology replacing a traditional form of directed teaching.
I see that, and in terms of a technology point of view, does a school need to have a certain amount of instruments and technology to begin with, or is that provided as part of the package of what you offer?
No, our package is very light, and we do offer some bundles through third-party suppliers, but that starts to get us into traders
yes.
And suppliers rather than something else, and that's not something that I've ever wanted Gigajam to be unduly distracted by. No, we deliver the software and the license, and then what we would normally expect is that schools would use the computers that they have available to them. And often classrooms are full of little MIDI keyboards of some description where they have a good starting point to be able to interact with our program at the earlier stages. And many of our schools come on board on the basis of, right, we're going to use the keyboard package. Then they go, right, this works, we like this. The next easy thing to implement in terms of size, odd as this may seem, is these small kind of Yamaha DD65 or the kind of replica type Chinese model makes like Gear for Music Maker, people like that, small tabletop drum kits with the little pedals that sort of replace the keyboard. So they expand it through the keyboards into the drums as well. And then they tend to just build. They just tend to build their practice around their experience.
And so it sounds like a very sort of secondary school kind of setup in terms of I remember sort of from being at school, that kind of everyone sat around sort of with a keyboard doing some kind of thing, and I really love the fact that there's much more progress and assessment and understanding of what's going on there. But do you also have the experience of being in primary schools as well?
Yes, thank you. It's a great question. I think the interesting thing about Gigajam is I would argue that Gigajam is appropriate from about the age of 10 upwards. Now, I've seen Gigajam being used with younger students, but of course that requires more intervention from the teacher. But we've got, say for instance, in the Highland Council, where we've been working with those guys, or they've been working on their own, quite frankly. They've been supplying Gigajam to 84 of their primary schools for the last 15 years. And they use a music service teacher to go and support the local primary schools in delivery. So that's part of their package, and that's their kind of wider opportunities. It's through the Youth Music Initiative that's very successful in Scotland. And as I say, that's been going a very long time. And that in itself demonstrates its success at primary level. And we've got schools in London, so West Byfleet, Southwest London. That's a very long standing primary customers. That's a junior school, and they use it in a very different way. So you've got classrooms which are used in curriculum time with the classroom teachers. You've got the Highland Council model where that's kind of bussed in, and it is literally bussed in because it's such a rural setting for them. They actually have two vans. One goes one way, or I like to think of it, they drive out of the gates on a Monday morning. One van goes in one direction, the van goes in the opposite direction. Now that could be absolute nonsense, but that's how I like to see it in my very simple Mr. Ben world. And they go visit the schools, and they have some equipment on their vans, as well as some equipment in the schools. So when the van drives away, they've still got some stuff to practice with. So that's a kind of, once a week style, drop in and learn. Secondary schools like Horbury Academy in Wakefield, they use it religiously, for want of a better word, in their classrooms. And West Byfleet, they use it as an after-school club. So, we've also had settings. Witham Park Academy in Blackburn, for instance, have used it breakfast club, lunch club, after school, in class, from home, in all sorts of different settings. So, yes, it is. I think my main targeting is secondary schools, of course. But it can be used in a wide variety of settings, including colleges, adult education, and we've got the Institute of Technology in Tralee in the Republic of Ireland who use it as part of their teacher training, how to use technology in music. So it can be used in a very wide range of settings.
Yeah, I think I've really sort of, in my mind now, I can really see how the primary teachers could sort of bring that into their school, because like you say, if you did it as an after school club, you can literally just, depending on how many instruments that you have, you could just do it as a small club just to get those people involved. And then once you're au fait with how it's working and you get the kids really engaged, you can then expand through there, your fundraising for whatever it happens to be through that year. You can get more computers if you need more specific computers, or more keyboards, or more guitars, or whatever that might be. And yeah. I hadn't quite realised the whole wider opportunities angle, which is a fantastic idea, because of course that works exactly as you just described it. If they're doing a Samba project, the music service or the trust or whoever's part of the hub that's organising it brings in a van load of instruments and leaves them for the 10 weeks. And the same if they're a bunch of ukuleles or strings and that kind of thing, all of which are available to hire. So actually, this is just exactly the same thing, an extension of that, except it would come in with keyboards, like you say, drum pads, guitars, whatever it was that they were going to be able to provide, and also be able to give those lessons as well. So you have that sort of specialist knowledge of what's going on at that point as well, which is also fantastic, I think, for the teachers, because certainly from the wider opportunities Samba things I've done, it always works much better when the teacher's heavily involved, because not only then are you delivering the music and the kids are getting the opportunity to perform, but also the teachers are learning as well. And then once the 10 weeks are finished, all your wider opportunities have actually had have finished their course, you're then still in a position to then carry on yourself in whichever form that you can. And that whole idea of being able to grow from just a starting point, I think, is a really key point.
I think it is. And I think, just making a couple of notes whilst you were speaking there, Mark, I think the interesting thing for me there is about sustainability. So we know that public money is scarce. We know that resources are tight, and we know that the best investment in our schools is the sort of 80% of a school budget that is invested into teachers. There's, that's without a doubt. All of the proof indicates there that it's about the quality of teaching. So bringing the teachers on board, not trying to replace them with some gizmo fancy technology nonsense, that's crazy. What it's about is actually providing a resource in the hands of a teacher that enables them to deliver more opportunities in different ways. And I think the wider opportunities as was, I'm not entirely sure we're allowed to say that anymore, are we? I think it's the first access.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
I mean, that sort of first access is really interesting, isn't it? Because I think one of my fears in the lots of project-based work that started to come out of the Music Manifesto, for instance, didn't provide the kind of legacy and progression, sustained and supported progression that people like Dick Hallam really, really wanted. How do we build these sustainable models to enable a child to pick up a musical instrument and then continue their musical education for years. I mean, we've got this kind of strange tension in the National Plan for Music, not wishing to get political here, but where they've reduced the requirement to 10 weeks. Every child should have 10 weeks at primary school. And we know it was hard enough to sustain that musical progression when we were really looking for a year's worth of education. So you need to have something that is affordable and can be delivered, not this year, but also next year for another cohort of children, and that they can take those skills and build on them. And what I really love to see is that, yes, children are drawn to guitars, bass, keyboards and drums. There's no doubt about that. But when they get the music service teachers coming in, like we have in Luton. So in Luton, the music service do a fantastic thing with a guy called Phil Knight, who's a guitarist. He goes into a school called Sundon Park Junior School. And he teaches, I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think it's 3 years of students. So they get Gigajam on whichever instrument they want, and they can vary that for 3 years. But what happens, and has happened time and time again in other schools, is when a student starts to feel encultured in music, in other words, they can play something, they get that confidence to actually go, actually, I'd quite like to learn the trumpet, or I really like the idea of the trombone, or the violin, or whatever. And I remember in the early days of when we did a lot of work with Tiverton High School, that the big message that came back is, because children have had a chance to learn to play a musical instrument, this happened to be through Gigajam, but there are others, delivery models, etc., that goes on. That child then actually felt musical as a result of it. And the surveys that built into the Music Manifesto research that has backed up all of the progress that we've made in music education is very much about giving children that opportunity to experience music hands-on. And that hands-on, for some people, we know is about learning a musical instrument. For others, it'll be about going to see music being performed, etc. But for very many, in the classroom on a wet Tuesday afternoon, it's about doing something interesting, and being active and being involved, and being supported in that with their teacher, the person that they have the most trusted relationship with. If music services are involved in that as well, then you've got this wonderful, cogent musical workforce structure for a workforce, all coming together to support the pupils. So I have always seen it that way. As I say, we have those examples of those different models with music services coming in and supporting schools, as well as schools operating entirely on their own.
Yeah, and what I would hope would happen with this, as the conversation's going on and the knowledge that we're learning here, is the fact that as a teacher, you do have access to money for music in your school, and actually going to your music hub and saying, look, I've heard of Gigajam and I've heard of this, and we do some singing in school, we've done some recorders, maybe some ukulele, we're looking to take it to the next level. We don't necessarily have an orchestra yet, we don't have any other instruments going on, but we think we can encourage more people and do some whole class music, and can you provide this? And actually there should be a way of certainly opening that dialogue, I think, to see how you can go about that, because like I say, that expansion and that working together, which is exactly why the music hubs were created, is what we're after. And I think actually, if you can't necessarily do it through that music hub, certainly opening that dialogue is a good place to start. And then even if you can get access to the money that you're entitled to as a school, you can then go about doing it on your own, which I think would be a really interesting thing as well, because there's obviously enough support and enough people around to be able to help you do that outside maybe of any of the music services that aren't willing to provide those things. So the other thing I'd ask you about is if you've got this course which is sort of within the classroom that the teachers are coordinating, can the children also do it on their own at home? Can they, if one of the children really think, I'm really loving this, but I want to keep going, but there's not enough time within the class time that they have, can they expand that themselves individually?
Absolutely. And a key part of Gigajam is very much about breaking down boundaries as much as we possibly can. So there was this, all the buzzwords of the early 2000s was about cross-boundary education, etc., etc. The realities of that are quite varied, I think. But the truth of the matter is that Gigajam students in schools where there's Gigajam operating have access to Gigajam anytime, anywhere, on any device. Although it's best on a Windows machine, they can. Gigajam is delivered through a browser, so if they've got a mobile phone or a tablet of some description, they can still watch all the videos. They've got exercises that they can play along with. They have access to all of that material anywhere, on the bus, in their bedroom at home. And that's a big thing for us. That's really, really important. And that kind of free at the point of access is a critical element. I remember Leonora Davies talking about this, that children should be able to have the opportunity to learn to play a musical instrument free at the point of access. Of course, somebody pays for it, but it's if we're going to actually equalise opportunity and chance, then we need to make sure that people can have access to this. So yeah, at school and at home, and our licence model is a very, very simple one for schools. If you buy a licence, everybody can use it. At school, at home.
Fantastic. And so that takes us nicely into, what is the license cost? How is there's someone listening out there who thinks this is a great idea? I'd like to find out more about it. What is the license cost, and what sort of fee are the school looking to have to invest in it?
Okay, so what we're doing increasingly now, because of budget constraints, is we're actually just simply talking to schools about how much they can afford to pay, but predicated. It's not just how much can we squeeze out of it. It's the opposite. It's our business model is based on £1.50 per pupil per year at school and at home. Now, that's a relatively small unit cost, but actually some schools are very big, so that number can start to add up. So say, for instance, if we talk about an average size secondary school, you're talking about 1,000 pupils. So you might be saying, right, okay, there's a bill of £1,000 for everybody to be able to have a go. Well, that's absolutely fine. £1,000 to £1,500. That's absolutely fine. But some schools, there's absolutely no way they could afford that because of the way their budgets are chopped up. And I understand that. So I would like a head of music to say, listen, actually, realistically, I want my year 9s to do this because I want some of them to be converted to doing music next year. Or they may say, I want to support every child that comes in at year 7. Or I want all of Key Stage 3 to do it, for instance. So I've got secondary schools with licenses of £150. I've got secondary schools with licenses of £1,500. So it depends upon what that head of music wants to do, how they are funded themselves. Do they have access to development bids and funding that enables them to go as big as possible? Or are they really reliant upon the budget that is as constrained by their photocopying costs as anything else? And I think heads of music would understand that. So based on £1.50 per pupil, give me a call, is what I would say. And what we also do is for music hubs, is we do licenses which says, look, every school can have access to this. So you can actually provide that for every school. So part of what you do could be simply, if you can't reach every single child in your borough or city or county, what you can at least do is provide them with Gigajam, free at school, free at home, wherever they are. And we discount that to about 80% of the cost. And that's based on the size of their grant. And again, it's based upon a sensible conversation about affordability.
So the most important thing for people listening to remember is that they need to go to gigajam.com and find your contact details and have a conversation. And I think the model of kind of, like you said, £1.50 a child is the fact that if you're really completely struggling and there is no money anywhere, certainly speaking as a parent, if it's something the school is really wanting to invest music as part of your child's education, even asking the parents to pay £1.50 is not the end of the world based on all the other things that we pay for various clubs, various trips and all that sort of thing. And while it's another cost, it's a cost which I think is well worth investing if you get to the point that you have no other alternative as well. And I think, but with, like you said, with the options of music services and hubs being involved, the idea of actually being able to start small and grow and get every child involved, I think it's great value, and I think that it's definitely a conversation to have, and I hope many people do get in contact and just sort of open that dialogue with you.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, I remember in the early days, I was criticised quite heavily for trying to be too worthy in what we're trying to do. But actually, the business has always been about trying to provide instrumental tuition to all of the 8 million pupils in our schools, free at the point of access. It's not a crazy amount of money. It is a sensible amount of money. But it also, with the sort of disaggregation of our system in the UK, in England in particular, it's all the more important that heads of music realise that there is something that is affordable to give their children a chance. So it's meant to be priced affordably. We can afford to do that. I hope that schools can afford to invest in that, and hopefully that gives more children a chance to start on that ladder to some form of musical career within their school life and maybe on afterwards.
That's fantastic. And Brian, thanks so much for chatting with us. I mean, I think we've got a really good understanding now about how it works and how to get in contact, and I think also how it can fit in the fabric of your musical life in a school as well. It's not it has to be like this, it has to be like that. I think it's part of a portfolio, as you said, of any kind of instrumental learning and any kind of music development. It really can sit with any of those things going on, and I think that's a really important takeaway for anybody that's listening at home. So yeah, thanks very much for being on the show today.
Not at all. Thanks, Mark. You've been very kind.
Thanks for listening to the Education on Fire podcast. For more information of each episode and to get in touch, go to educationonfire.com. Education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire.